has been providing strategic research and analytic support for an ongoing pay-for-success feasibility study in California. Using data from the county system and its structured decision-making system implementation, the analysis provides insights into how to best understand and define potential intervention populations. Previously, Dr. Russell was research manager at the National Council on Juvenile and Family Court Judges. He completed his doctorate at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He was an assistant professor at the Seton Hall University School of Diplomacy and International Relations, where he taught courses in research methodology. Dr. Russell.
Good afternoon, and thank you for staying here for the afternoon part of it. Do you want to start pulling the slides up? I'm going to talk about risk assessment specifically as one component piece of sort of a broader sort of system of juvenile justice practice and really juvenile justice reform. And there's risk assessment maybe plays two different roles in the juvenile justice world. One role is really the case level, helping probation workers, juvenile justice workers make structured decisions, make good decisions around the cases that they serve. Risk assessment also plays another role around helping juvenile justice systems make good decisions around who they should serve and how to make strategic decisions about their practice. And that's really what I want to talk about today is at the juvenile justice system level, how risk assessment plays a role for them in allocating the resources that they have and really targeting the interventions that they have. So in a world where there's, you're good, anticipating, yeah, thank you. So in a world where resources are scarce and there are some known interventions that can be really good interventions and some interventions that maybe aren't as good. And there are definitely some youth who need these interventions. Part of the question is to get to which youth should we deploy these resources for? Who should we be worried about? Who's appropriate for intervention? So this is sort of the question, and that risk assessment helps juvenile justice systems identify which youth who have come into the system they should focus on. And part of the goal of this is that youth come into the system, and we want them to be successful. We want more successful youth making a more successful transition to young adulthood. We also want communities to be safer. So those two goals together mean that there's an opportunity for intervention, but the big part of the question is, who should you focus on? You can go ahead to the next one. So the part of this is risk assessment answer a who question. Who should we be worried about? Who is most likely to come back into the system if we don't intervene? Who is more likely to get in trouble again sometime in the future? In a sense that if what we want to do is prevent future offending, we want to prevent future involvement in the juvenile justice system. We want to prevent youth from staying on the wrong track. That we want to answer this question of if the goal is prevention, what can we actually prevent? A lot of youth come into the system that they're not going to get into trouble again to begin with, so you're not going to prevent anything by intervening in their cases. So this is the basic question is, the risk assessment tells us which youth should we be most worried about. You can go ahead to the next one. At the same time, risk assessment can tell you about who should you be less worried about. Who should we be keeping out of the system? And intervention sometimes can increase the likelihood of reoffending, increase the likelihood of coming back into the system. Even good interventions, even evidence-based programs, when applied to the wrong group of youth, is going to make it worse. And it's important to note that even good programs, even good interventions, even evidence-based programs, if they're applied to the wrong set of juveniles in the system, is going to make them more likely to reoffend in the future. So there's a big question of this sort of who not? Who should be diverted out of the system? You can go to the next one. So even though I'm suggesting that risk assessment can really help answer this question, who should we be focused on? Who should we be worried about in the system? Who should we be deploying our resources on behalf of? There's a bunch of other questions that could be asked. There's questions like why? Why are some youth more likely to get in trouble? It's a great question. It's a great question for researchers. It's not generally the fundamental question that juvenile justice systems themselves are asking at this point. When they have youth coming in and they have a question, well, why are some youth more likely to get into trouble again in the future? It needs to be answered. It's definitely informative. But it's not the question that the risk assessment helps you answer when you're trying to identify which youth should be the focus of your system. And the second question is another question that's a good one is how? How should we intervene for high-risk youth? Again, it's an important question, and the risk assessment won't generally help you answer this question. A youth gets classified as high youth, and you say, this is a kid we should be worried about. This is a youth for whom intervention makes a lot of sense. The risk assessment generally won't tell you how you should intervene. And I defer to others, and these are a lot of things that have already been talked about today, but the how is basically evidence-based programs. There's a lot of therapeutic interventions like multi-systemic therapy, family functional therapy, that can work, positive youth development approaches. So I want to just sort of outline this in terms of what a risk assessment isn't and doesn't do. So you can go ahead. At the core of this is, and this is, again, too small to read from here, and this is something that a lot of people have talked about already, that the juvenile brain is not fully formed. And there's a little bit of a rabbit and a hare story in terms of the juvenile brain, that there's this risk acceptance part of the juvenile brain that is a hare that is just taken off. That they get rewarded for risky behavior and it feels good. And meanwhile, good decisions are this plodding along tortoise. Eventually, the hare is going to run out of steam, and eventually the tortoise is going to catch up. And so the opportunity here is to actually intervene during this time while the hare is catching up and help steer these youth through in the meantime. So you can go ahead. So the risk assessment really just tells you sort of getting at this. So there's a great potential for intervention. And so it's come up a number of times today that implementation, and fidelity of implementation is key. So what I want to talk about through this next part is what that really means in terms of using risk assessment. This sort of risk assessments are data-driven tools. They look at past history. They look at known risk factors from the research and say, given these factors, can we sort of apply some criteria, usually in an actuarial type of sense? But there's a question about, like, just because it can work to help guide how you target your interventions and guide how you allocate resources, there's a way of making sure that it's actually working. So if you want to, I'm going to go through these. There's just 4 of them. The first one is about validity. Validity is about accurate measurement. I have some measuring cups up here, and anyone who's ever cooked anything ever, I ask you a question. If you had a recipe that called for 1 cup and you, maybe in one scenario you didn't have a cup measure at all, and you just grabbed a handful of flour and you threw it in there and be like, it's a handful. How much difference could it possibly make? Or another scenario, the machine that manufactured these cups was just broken and your 1 cup measure actually just held a different amount. It doesn't matter how great the recipe is, your recipe is not going to work out if the actual accuracy is off. The same thing is true when you're talking about which youth we should intervene on. You have to have an accurate sense of who that should be. It can't be just a gut decision. Measuring is a great way of going about it. Measure accurately. Okay. The next thing that has to happen is equity is about similar likelihoods for subgroups. A standard here is that different subgroups, whether it's rural and urban, whether it's boys and girls, whether it's white kids and black kids, that equity has to be a key part of this consideration. It's not the job of a risk assessment to solve all problems of bias and equity in the system, but it needs to make sure that once we get to this sort of question of who should we be bringing into the system, who should we be targeting for interventions, that it's not an inequitable decision, that everyone has an equal likelihood of coming up as high risk or low risk or moderate risk. And then there's reliability. So there's There's sort of validity and accuracy. There's the equity and fairness question. And then there's this reliability and consistency question, which says risk assessment has to be something that everyone gets the same answer to the same question. It shouldn't be the fact that if I'm a youth who gets brought in on a Saturday and I have a weekend worker there who does a risk assessment and they complete it and they say high risk. But if I had just committed the same offense a couple of hours later, and now it's Sunday and I see, or it's Monday morning and I see someone else, they complete the same assessment and they say, moderate risk. It has to be something that no matter what, the same workers on the same day using the same instrument can come up with a similar sort of score. And utility is about the right tool for the right job. Do you need a wrench in this picture? Risk assessment helps you answer this important question, which would be, which youth do I need to focus my energy on? Who should I be worried about? There's a lot of other questions. Don't use a risk assessment for other questions, just like don't use a wrench when you need a screwdriver. Doesn't matter how great that wrench is. That might be the best wrench ever. It's made in the United States, it's forged steel, it's been tested lots of different ways. It's a great wrench, but it's absolutely useless if you need a hammer or a screwdriver. Okay. So given this, what we did actually was risk assessments are actually currently used all around the country. So we asked whether they do in fact work. We know the potential is there for them to work. We know the criteria by which we can understand if they work. So we, through an OJGDP funded national study, we looked at 10 different risk assessments in practice. So asked according to these same criteria, are they valid? Are they accurate? Are they fair? Are they equitable? Are they reliable? Do they actually do the things that people need them to do? You can go to the next slide. So, oh, that's really weird that the slides, the labels on there don't work. That must be a set. I'm going to blame that on technology. So in this example, there's two different graphs here. There's a top one and a bottom one. I won't linger too long on this, but the top one represents the distribution, that dark blue category, name, whatever that is. That darker blue on the top, low risk. The lighter blue, moderate risk. And the orange group is high risk. And that normally is something you'd look at that and you say, there's no golden key answer on distributions. But you look at that and be like, there's a range, right? Not every youth is being classified to the same category. Some youth are being classified to each category. If you think that the moderate category is sort of average, the dark blue is below average likelihood of getting in trouble again, and the orange is above average likelihood of getting in trouble again, that kind of makes sense. And if you look at the bottom graph, that's the actual follow-up rate. So in this case, the low risk category recidivated at 11%, and the moderate risk at 27%, and the high risk at 42%. So in this case, you look at this and say, that's actually a pretty helpful tool. That can tell you that you should worry a lot about the kids in that high risk group because they are much more likely to get in trouble again. And you probably shouldn't worry about that low risk group because they're really fundamentally not very likely to get in trouble again. You go to the next one. Is a different risk assessment from a different jurisdiction. You can see that it's not up here, obviously, or it should have been, but about 88% of all their youth were classified as low risk, and about 1% as high risk. So that distribution all by itself seems useless. I don't know what you would do with that. And again, if you look at the actual follow-up rates, you see that the moderate group recidivated at about 52%, and the high group at about 58%. It doesn't seem like a very helpful distinction. So between those two of them, it doesn't take a whole lot to be able to take a look at least this one sort of picture and say, yeah, risk assessment definitely can work. It can be a super good tool. On the other hand, it's not automatically a great tool. This risk assessment actually is no longer being used. I think they saw these results and said, let's do something else. So you can go to the next slide. This is my last slide. Trying to be quick. And so risk assessment, the bottom line, risk assessment can support positive youth development, safer communities. The goal is those two things together. Find the right youth to intervene in a preventative sense of saying we should be worried about some kids. Which kids are those so that we can worry about them in positive ways, make sure that they have a successful transition to young adulthood, make sure that our communities are safer. That can happen. At the same time, though, standards need to be embraced for that.